Now, Western leaders have threatened Russia with more sanctions days before Sunday's planned referendum in Crimea, which could see the territory annexed from Ukraine. Leaders from the G7 nations said that the intimidating presence of Russian troops would make the vote deeply flawed with no legal effect. And speaking in Israel, David Cameron said if Russia does not respond to the latest diplomatic efforts, it could face more targeted sanctions. Well, fresh from his meeting about Ukraine with the Foreign Secretary William Hague, I caught up with Carl Bildt, Sweden's foreign minister, and one of Europe's most respected elder statesmen. Foreign Minister, Crimea is over, isn't it? I mean, the red line exists, and we're not going to cross it.
It's not over, because we are in for a fairly lengthy period of a crisis with Russia. Russia has now embarked on a course of armed action against neighbours. And that will, of course, have to require a fairly sustained response for some time to come.
Well, that suggests that you have concerns, particularly as you come from Sweden, about, for example, the Baltic states, countries that have large Russian minorities in them.
I think we would have a concern for virtually every place in Europe. It is a fundamental principle.
Well, it suggests a Cold War.
Well, a Cold War and Cold War, I wish it was cold. It's fairly hot to some extent in Crimea. What has been happening is that a fundamental principle of European security, that is that you don't invade other countries. You don't take your armed forces into another country under the one pretext or the other. That has been fundamentally violated by Russia. What they did was to insert substantial forces from all over Russia into Crimea, spread them out, have special forces taking over the parliament of Crimea, installing a puppet regime, having that puppet regime deliver a request for assistance. I mean, we've seen this before in European history.
So what do you and Mr. Hague think should be done? I mean, what can be done, frankly?
Well, I mean, we should never give up on diplomacy. So effort should be made in order to get the Russians to understand the magnitude of what they're doing and the severity of the consequences that will roll out over years.
But you can't do much because we're so dependent. I mean, the City of London is dependent. You and the Germans and lots of other people are very dependent on Russian gas.
At the end of the day, the Russians are far more dependent upon us than we are dependent upon the Russians. I mean, you might say that sort of some people are dependent upon Russian gas, but Russia is depending upon the money coming with the gas or from the gas. So their dependence on Europe is vast. Europe's dependence upon Russia is fairly marginal, if you look at it over a longer period of time.
And what do you want Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry to do when they meet here in London on Friday?
Well, try to achieve a solution. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I said we should always be sort of try to do our utmost in diplomacy. But they should sort of course, stop this referendum, which is illegal. They should have the Russian forces going back to their bases, and they should be prepared to engage with the government in Kiev.
And a quick question on Europe. You are very much, I mean, the Swedes are regarded as Britain's closest allies on Europe, or certainly that's how Mr. Cameron reads you. I mean, do you have any understanding of what any renegotiation by Britain might involve? Have you?
We are following the UK debate with sort of great interest to see what ideas are coming up. But let me say in general terms that Europe is facing first a competitiveness challenge, which David Cameron is talking about, and he's entirely right on that one. We are facing the rise of an authoritarian power towards our east, with all of the implications of that. We are facing chaos and instability to our south. The fragmentation of Europe is not in the interest of anyone. To weaken Europe at this particular time is dangerous for every one of our countries.
Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, talking to me earlier outside the British Foreign Office.